everyone, welcome to my video essay on the evolution of the character Alice from Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Today I want to explore this character from a feminist lens and look at how different audiences that each Alice was created for affect how she was depicted as a character. Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was a book published in 1865 and written for a Victorian audience, whereas Tim Burton released his film adaptation in 2010. The first thing we have to assess is how Carroll's story is a piece of children's fiction, and so in many ways falls in line with how children's fiction has always been. Writing for children can be used as a tool for indoctrination or passing down belief systems depending on how you look at it. You always have to remember that this is fiction written for children but by adults. This usually leads to didactic stories with heavy messaging about morality and expected behavior. So children's books are essentially a place for adults of society to introduce and teach morals and societal values of the time. In Angela Smith's article, Letting Down Rapunzel, Feminism's Effect on Fairy Tales, she talks about how fairy tales, especially once they've transitioned from oral to written, began to reflect social morals surrounding a child readership. She writes, "A text is a product of the contradictory and complex beliefs of the society that shaped it. And in the case of texts written for children, there's even more of an attempt by the dominant voices to reinforce and naturalize mainstream views for those whom they see as its most impressionable members." Smith suggests when stories are republished, they renegotiate cultural values, and that fairy tales can be considered a form of cultural currency. Children's fiction, as well as movies, can also fall under this category of currency used to exchange cultural values. Of course, as the article's title suggests, Smith chooses to focus on Rapunzel and fairy tales, but I extend this to cover popular children's stories in general. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is arguably popular and a well-known symbol for female adventure. The 1865 book got a sequel called Through the Looking Glass, and these stories have been adapted into film once by Walt Disney in 1951, and once most recently in 2010 when Disney Studios hired Tim Burton to creatively adapt the story. And the story can often be seen influencing many other mediums and has left a lasting impression on popular culture. So this story can be considered similar to fairy tales in that it also had many retellings and a strong cultural impact. Angela Smith suggests that these stories can be considered a form of cultural capital. They can be referenced and connote meaning to help us understand things. She uses the example of Rapunzel's hair or Cinderella's slipper. Even without reading these stories, these phrases have strong references attached to them which are universally understood. The story of falling down a rabbit hole into a new world is enshrined into popular culture. In order to fully understand Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, we must first understand how it presents itself as a proto-feminist text. And this is largely because it subverts gender expectations of the time. At a time where little Victorian girls were expected to grow into respectable and obedient women designated to the domestic sphere, Lewis Carroll deliberately entitled his book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. An adventure was an opportunity reserved for boy characters. The research of Catalina 𝘈𝘆𝑥𝑖anu argues that children's fiction operates with an inherent framework of authority. She reiterates the power imbalance between children and adults in children's fiction. So this means that the book can be viewed as him trying to directly communicate with his child reader. 𝘈𝘆𝑥𝑖anu writes, "Carroll was aware that children's books introduced their readers into gender stereotypes due to their didactic nature. There existed specific stories for boys, full of journeys, adventures, crimes, and fights, and those created specifically for girls, which insisted upon friendship, loyalty, romantic love, or on the domestic atmosphere." Carroll resisted gender expectations typical to children's fiction by creating a female character who traveled alone to a strange world outside of her home. Alice's story does not revolve around her relationship with others. Alice interacts with the world around her, and the characters she does meet don't impart heavy-handed morals. Instead, they confuse her and question the things she knows to be true. Overall, Lewis Carroll takes the opportunity to criticize Alice's middle-class formal education. Every time Alice tries to assert things she has learned, the creatures of Wonderland often ridicule her. Carroll's book writes Alice as a proto-feminist character because she is given an incredible amount of agency that would be an impossibility for her if she was a real girl living in Victorian society. But there are limits in place. Ultimately, the ending makes the story more palatable to a Victorian audience because the adventure was all just a dream. On the surface, it seems that the dream sequence undoes everything Alice has experienced. Yet, it's important to consider that the use of fantasy was also subversive in nature because it imparted the importance of dreaming and imagination to young girls. By the end of the book, she gains the confidence to confront the creatures of Wonderland. 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘤𝘶𝘴 and 𝘞𝘰𝘯𝘥𝘷𝘦𝘯𝘭𝘢𝑔 report in their article Alice Through the Ages, Childhood and Adaptation, not only are Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass eccentric, innovative, original, and magical, they also embody a great paradox. The modern fantasy genre, even though it speaks of the impossible, strange, and unusual, gives us an opportunity to deal with and confront daily issues. Real-life issues such as sexism, inadequate education for girls, and to depict a world where girls could have such freedoms. It seems that the use of fantasy was necessary to conceal hidden feminist values Carroll wished to convey to his child readership. The audience he was writing for played an integral part of how Carroll could choose to depict Alice. It was also the modern contemporary audience that allowed Tim Burton to fully showcase Alice as a strong female lead in his 2010 adaptation. The research of James Pope and Julia Round in their article Children's Responses to Heroism in Roald Dahl's Matilda support my argument that the audience has influenced changing attitudes toward girls. They conducted research in 2013 with 150 children, where they asked children about their feelings towards Matilda. The story features a young girl who uses her magical powers to exact revenge on the adults who wrong her. Her character shows how much has changed in how female characters are depicted since Carroll's 1865 novel. This research showed that Matilda, who was criticized by many adults for being a bad influence, is ultimately admired by children. Children go as far as describing her as a hero, which is discerned from the term protagonist. Not only are their opinions consulted and matter in this academic research, but they are also cultivated and encouraged. Children can critically interact with the stories they consume. It also shows that there exists a desire to see girls occupy subversive roles in books as well as films. As time passes, children's literature and film reflect the audiences that they are created for. They become more valued as little individuals regardless of gender. Modern sensibilities and attitudes towards equality, female empowerment, and girls in general allowed Burton to depict Alice without restriction in a way that Carroll just could not. This also is reiterated in the research of 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘤𝘶𝘴 and 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘤𝘴, who argue that through the three different versions of Alice, it is possible to see how childhood and growing up changed during that substantial period of time by observing Alice as a Victorian child, a 1950s American child, and a contemporary teen. There are two mainstream examples of film adaptations for Carroll's book. The first one was created by Walt Disney in 1951. This depiction of Alice is very interesting because she is less active than Carroll's Alice. You would think a film released 86 years later would pick up on feminist undertones, but this links directly to my argument that each Alice served as a reflection of the society. Alice of Carroll's book ultimately criticizes society's expectations of a child. Laws were created to protect children and their innocence, and a greater emphasis on gender roles was expanded beyond upper-class children and projected onto the average working-class child. This meant that Walt Disney's Alice would be frozen in a state of perpetual childhood. It is also important because Disney was also an American recreation of the original Alice. This meant, in terms of didactic messaging, there was a focus on grooming the all-American adult. The character was also depicted in classic Disney style, which meant the use of humor, stress on moral values, innocence, romance, and a reliance on gender stereotypes. And this is the case for the majority of the film. 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘤𝘶𝘴 and 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘤𝘴 argue that, in fact, this Alice experiences a non-identity crisis. She experiences no change and remains the same even after her experience in Wonderland. Although the film supports my idea of how Alice becomes a place to negotiate societal values due to prevalent sexist ideas of the time, Disney's version of Alice chose not to interpret Carroll's character's feminist qualities and even downplayed them. It's especially interesting that this rendition does choose to emphasize unwriting Wonderland. Alice does not save herself, as is noted by 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘤𝘶𝘴 and 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘤𝘴. She is saved because she wakes up from her nightmarish dream. This is important because, as I mentioned earlier, the element of fantasy was so crucial for Alice to explore her agency. By the end of the book, Carroll's Alice tries to fight back, but Disney's Alice shows Alice running away and being saved by waking up from her dream. This brings us to the second film, which was also produced by Disney, but obviously directed by Tim Burton. This is relevant because in recent years, Disney has been making a push for films with feminist messages. Examples of this include Moana, Brave, and Frozen. Tim Burton's 2010 production is special because not only is it created in his signature style, but it also is not just a simple recreation of the book, but it's a creative retelling that positions itself more as a sequel. This means that Wonderland appears to be a place of great uncertainty. It's Burton-esque in that the audience does not know if Wonderland is an entirely safe place. It comes across as strange and sometimes even unfriendly. It also chooses to portray Alice as a 19-year-old girl rather than the 8-year-old girl from Carroll's book. In the film, Alice is headed to her own surprise engagement to the ordinary, dull, and rather unheroic Hamish, she feels restricted by the expectations of Victorian society on womanhood. She is distracted by the sight of a white rabbit in a waistcoat and runs away from Hamish after he proposes, following it down the rabbit hole. All the characters remember Alice, and she vaguely remembers them as characters from a dream that she used to have as a child. Burton's film immediately negates the fantastical element of Carroll's book. His Alice did not imagine these characters. Her journey into Wonderland as a child is positioned as a real, forgotten memory instead. She visited them as a child, and now they were calling her back to fulfill the prophecy of slaying the Jabberwocky. This is one way that Burton's rendition of the original story attempts to create a more realized feminist depiction. Using fantasy helped Carroll avoid accusations of corrupting the minds of young girl readers. Contemporary audiences have a changed understanding of girlhood, and the generally accepted ideals of feminism make the story of a girl going on an adventure not only palatable, but even commonplace. The audience plays an integral role in the ultimate feminist realization of the story 145 years after its first conception. 𝘈𝘭𝘪 and 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘁 argue Burton's depiction of the character of Alice is obviously conditioned by the contemporary circumstances of growing up. The way we measure success as an adult has significantly changed over the years regardless of gender. For a long time, success was measured through marriage and family, but according to the research of Fussell and Furstenberg Jr. in 2005, a survey produced that success was now predominantly determined by factors such as the completion of education or securing a full-time job. Unlike Carroll's book, as well as most Victorian children's literature, there no longer exists a need to encourage and prepare impressionable youth to fulfill the role of husband or wife. According to 𝘈𝘭𝘪 and 𝘈𝘭𝘪𝘁, the identity crisis that Alice experiences also reflects the audience she was created for. They write, due to the consumer and technology-based culture, a postmodern culture, which leads to self-pluralism, one is presented with many different choices and variety of possible identities. In his reinterpretation of Alice in Wonderland, Tim Burton addresses the issues of self-pluralism and depicts Alice as a postmodern female hero who embraces an alternative reality, often dispensing with logic and reason, overcomes obstacles, and undergoes a coming-of-age experience in order to find her authentic self. Self-pluralism is the idea that your identity does not need to fit into one box. You can identify in more than one way, and each part of you comprises your entire identity. In the film, Alice struggles with being the wrong Alice. Ultimately, Alice gets to be the hero, which is a role traditionally reserved for boys. At the end of the film, we see Alice actively reject Hamish in a way that seems consistent with Carroll's ending, where she realizes her power once she's reached her full size and finally stands up for herself. She chooses to pursue a career instead of resigning to a traditional role of repressed housewife. This is a reassertion of Carroll's development of Alice. As she interacts with Wonderland and its creatures, she grows confident in herself and becomes an active agent attempting to assert her own personhood. Although Carroll's Alice may be represented as a child in her society, in Wonderland she develops and asserts her own will. Burton's Alice also gains agency, and it is not unwritten but has repercussions that extend outside of Wonderland and into her real life. Despite Burton's and Disney Studios' adoption of strong feminist messaging in their films in recent years, it's important to evaluate whether film can truly be considered feminist or a form of consumer feminism. Alice of the film is much older and struggles with fitting into society. She experiences a cognitive dissonance between what she is being told and how she feels. By the end of the film, she empowers herself by accepting who she really is. She is the right Alice. Slaying the Jabberwocky can be considered a metaphor for fulfilling her destiny and realizing the prophecy, which is becoming who she was all along. The scared Alice that ran away from Hamish's proposal at the beginning of the film returns and confidently turns him down and actively chooses to pursue a career instead. But questions do remain about the rest of the characters and their fates. The warring queens turn out to be quibbling sisters and are reduced to young, immature girls. They're ultimately not the all-powerful, independent queens that they were portrayed to be. There's also the question of the aunt. She's painted as a delusional old spinster. Even after Alice's return, the aunt continues to be a pitiable character. Her mother is a helpless widow who's desperate to marry off her daughters, and her sister is in a loveless marriage and being cheated on by her husband. Besides Alice, there doesn't seem to be another role model within the film for little girls to look up to. This may be due to Burton's desire to portray the realistic restrictions on women in the Victorian era. All these women live repressed lives and are the victims to either infantilization young women experience or to the constricting expectations of female adulthood. Another reason this may have been a deliberate choice on the part of Burton may be to set Alice up as the outsider. She is special. She is the chosen one. Although the film does have a few inconsistencies in its feminist message, I do believe that the film ultimately does Carroll's Alice justice by depicting her as an unapologetically strong female character. In conclusion, in 1865, Lewis Carroll wrote a progressive female character in Alice. In many ways, he tried to subvert gender roles but needed to be careful to ensure his story could reach a large readership. He strategically framed the story as fantasy in order not to alarm Victorian readership while still sneaking in feminist feminist messaging. Children's stories are a place to negotiate societal values, and so they must interact with the audience they are written for. The modern views of Tim Burton's audience allowed him to update the story and write Alice as an openly feminist character in a way that Carroll couldn't. Just as Alice traveled through Wonderland and came back a transformed character, she has journeyed through time in order to finally be represented as the strong, intelligent, bold female character she always was.